The wrought iron gates of Blackwood Manor creaked open with an ominous groan that seemed to echo through the entire valley, reverberating off the surrounding hills like a warning bell tolling in the distance. Maria Santos clutched her worn leather suitcase tighter as she walked up the cobblestone path, her determined footsteps the only sound breaking the eerie silence that enveloped the estate like a suffocating shroud. The mansion loomed before her like a gothic cathedral transported from another century, its towering spires piercing the gray afternoon sky, while gargoyles perched on every corner seemed to watch her approach with stone eyes that held centuries of secrets and untold stories. Ivy crawled up the ancient walls like skeletal fingers reaching toward heaven, and the massive oak doors bore intricate carvings that told stories of a family's rise to power and wealth through generations of ambition and ruthless determination. The perfectly manicured gardens on either side of the path were too pristine, too controlled, as if nature itself had been bent to someone's iron will and forced to conform to an impossible standard of perfection. Ancient oak trees cast shadows that seemed to shift and move of their own accord, and the carefully trimmed hedges formed maze-like patterns that suggested hidden pathways and secret destinations. Maria had heard the whispers in town about this place, about the succession of maids who had fled in terror after only days or weeks of employment. But she needed this job more than she feared whatever lurked within these imposing walls. The butler who answered the door was a tall, gaunt man, whose pale complexion seemed to match the marble columns flanking the entrance, as if he had somehow absorbed the very essence of the mansion itself over decades of faithful service. His name was Hartwell, and he moved through the mansion's corridors with the silent efficiency of someone who had learned to make himself invisible over countless years, gliding across the floors like a specter from another age. The interior of Blackwood Manor was a testament to wealth accumulated over generations. Crystal chandeliers imported from Venice cast dancing shadows on mahogany panels carved by master craftsmen. Persian rugs worth small fortunes covered floors of imported Italian marble, and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors gazed down from gilded frames with expressions that seemed to judge all who passed beneath them with the weight of centuries. The air itself felt heavy with the weight of history and secrets, carrying the faint scent of lavender and something else Maria couldn't quite identify, something that made the hair on her arms stand on end and sent shivers down her spine, despite the warmth of the afternoon. Hartwell's instructions were delivered in clipped, precise tones that brooked no questions, his eyes holding a warning that went unspoken, but was clearly understood by anyone with enough sense to read between the lines. The previous maids' quarters were spotless, as if their brief tenures had left no trace of human habitation, and Maria wondered what had driven them away so quickly that they couldn't even be bothered to collect their personal belongings before fleeing into the night. Eleanor Blackwood's first appearance was nothing short of theatrical, a carefully orchestrated entrance that had been perfected over years of ruling her domain with absolute authority. She descended the grand staircase like a queen making her entrance at court, her black silk dress flowing behind her like liquid shadow, while her jewelry caught the light from the chandeliers and threw it back in sharp, brilliant fragments that seemed to cut through the air itself. Her silver hair was pulled back in an elaborate chignon that emphasized the sharp angles of her aristocratic face, and her pale blue eyes seemed to pierce right through Maria's carefully constructed confidence, like daggers finding their mark. The clicking of her heels on the marble floor created a rhythm that felt almost hypnotic, echoing through the vast entrance hall with the precision of a metronome marking time until the final judgment. When she finally came to a stop at the bottom of the staircase, the silence that followed was so complete that Maria could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears like drums announcing the arrival of doom. This was the woman who had terrorized a dozen maids into fleeing, the fearsome widow whose very presence was said to drain the warmth from any room she entered and leave behind only the chill of the grave. Eleanor's gaze traveled slowly from Maria's worn shoes to her carefully pinned hair, taking in every detail with the calculating precision of a predator sizing up potential prey and finding it potentially wanting. The other servants had vanished from sight as if they possessed some sixth sense that warned them to make themselves scarce whenever their mistress appeared, leaving Maria alone to face this legendary figure whose reputation had spread throughout the county like wildfire. The first week at Blackwood Manor tested every ounce of courage Maria possessed, challenging her determination with trials that seemed designed to break even the strongest spirit. Eleanor seemed to materialize in whatever room Maria was cleaning, appearing without warning like a phantom conjured from the very shadows themselves, her pale eyes watching every movement with an intensity that made the simple act of dusting feel like performing surgery under a microscope while the world held its breath. She never raised her voice above a whisper, but her soft-spoken criticisms cut deeper than any shouting could have, pointing out invisible specks of dust that only her eagle eyes could detect, questioning Maria's methods with a coldness that seemed to leach the warmth from the very air and replace it with the chill of perpetual winter. The other servants moved through the mansion like ghosts haunting their own lives, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when absolutely necessary, their faces bearing the haunted expressions of people who had learned to survive by becoming invisible and hoping that invisibility would protect them from notice. Strange sounds echoed through the corridors at night, footsteps in empty hallways when everyone was supposed to be asleep, doors closing when no one was near them, and a soft weeping that seemed to come from the walls themselves, as if the very stones were mourning some ancient tragedy. Maria's room was located in the servants' quarters on the 3rd floor, a sparse but clean space that felt more like a monastic cell than a bedroom, with a single window that looked out over the estate's sprawling grounds, where ancient oak trees cast shadows that never seemed to shift despite the passage of hours, creating the unsettling impression that time itself moved differently within the mansion's boundaries. The breaking point came during Maria's 2nd week, when she discovered Eleanor in the mansion's library, a vast room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that seemed to contain all the knowledge and secrets of the world, their spines bearing titles in languages both familiar and foreign. Eleanor was seated in a wingback chair beside the massive stone fireplace, but she wasn't reading. Instead, she was staring into the flames with an expression of such profound sadness that it transformed her entire face, revealing glimpses of the woman hidden beneath the fearsome mask she wore for the world like armor protecting a wounded heart. The firelight danced across her features, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to tell their own story of loss and longing. And for a moment, the two women simply looked at each other across the cavernous room filled with the wisdom of ages. Maria saw something in Eleanor's eyes that made her heart skip. Not malice or cruelty, but a pain so deep and raw that it had calcified into the hardness everyone feared, like a pearl formed around a grain of sand that had cut too deeply to ever be removed. The silence stretched between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm, and Maria realized that she was seeing Eleanor Blackwood as no one had seen her for years, not as the fearsome mistress of Blackwood Manor, but as a woman whose heart had been shattered so completely that she had forgotten how to let anyone close enough to see the pieces. It was in that moment of unexpected vulnerability that Maria understood the truth. Eleanor Blackwood wasn't a monster at all, but a woman who had armored herself in cruelty because it was the only way she knew how to protect what remained of her devastated soul from further damage. Maria made her decision with the same determination that had brought her to the mansion in the first place, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed until this moment of truth arrived. Instead of fleeing like her predecessors, she walked directly into the library and took a seat in the chair across from Eleanor, ignoring the sharp intake of breath that greeted this unprecedented breach of protocol and social boundaries. The fire crackled between them like a living thing, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across their faces, while the weight of unspoken words filled the space with electricity that seemed to make the very air vibrate with possibility. Eleanor's mask snapped back into place with practiced efficiency, her features hardening into the familiar expression of cold disdain. But Maria had seen behind it now, and refused to be intimidated by a performance she recognized for what it was. A desperate attempt to maintain control when the foundations of that control were already crumbling. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, each woman waiting for the other to make the first move in a game whose rules had never been clearly defined, but whose stakes were becoming increasingly apparent with each passing moment. Outside the tall windows, storm clouds gathered over the estate grounds with ominous intent, and the first drops of rain began to streak the glass, while wind howled through the ancient oak trees, with a sound like voices calling from another world, as if the very elements themselves were responding to the tension building within the mansion's walls. Eleanor's hands gripped the arms of her chair with white-knuckled intensity, and Maria could see the war being fought behind those pale blue eyes, a battle between the need to maintain the carefully constructed barriers that had protected her for so long and the desperate longing to let someone, anyone, see past them to the woman she had once been. "You're not like the others," Eleanor finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying clearly across the space between them. Each word weighted with years of accumulated pain and the faint hope that this time might be different. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and an invitation rolled into one, and Maria could feel the weight of all the other maids who had sat in similar situations before choosing flight over fight, their ghostly presence seeming to fill the room with unspoken questions about courage and its limits. The firelight continued its ancient dance, painting pictures on the walls that seemed to tell stories of their own. And somewhere in the depths of the mansion, a clock chimed the midnight hour with deep, resonant tones that seemed to echo through Maria's very bones and announce that they had crossed some invisible threshold from which there might be no return. Eleanor's confession came slowly, painfully, like drawing poison from a wound that had been festering for years beneath carefully applied bandages of indifference and cruelty. She had loved once, deeply and completely, with the kind of passion that poets write about and ordinary people dream of finding. But loss had taught her that vulnerability was a luxury she could no longer afford if she wanted to survive in a world that seemed designed to destroy everything beautiful and pure. The fearsome reputation, the cruel words, the impossible standards, all of it was armor designed to keep the world at arm's length where it couldn't hurt her again, where she could exist in a kind of emotional hibernation that protected her from further damage. Maria listened without judgment, recognizing in Eleanor's story echoes of her own struggles with loss and the different ways people learn to survive when life stripped away everything they thought they couldn't live without, leaving them naked and defenseless against the winds of fate. The transformation began slowly, like sunrise creeping over a landscape that had been shrouded in darkness for too long, each day bringing subtle changes that only became apparent when viewed from the perspective of time's passage. Eleanor didn't suddenly become warm and welcoming. Decades of carefully constructed defenses couldn't be dismantled overnight like temporary scaffolding around a completed building. But the sharp edges of her cruelty began to dull, replaced by something that wasn't quite kindness, but wasn't the familiar harshness either. A middle ground that neither woman had expected to find. Maria continued her work with the same quiet determination that had brought her this far, but now she understood the rules of the game they were playing. Eleanor needed to maintain her reputation as the fearsome mistress of Blackwood Manor, while slowly allowing herself to remember what it felt like to trust another human being with even the smallest pieces of her carefully guarded heart. The other servants began to notice the change, whispering among themselves about how the new maid had somehow managed to survive when so many others had fled, their conversations carrying a mixture of admiration and bewilderment that someone had finally cracked the code of Eleanor Blackwood's seemingly impenetrable defenses. The mansion itself seemed to respond to the shifting dynamics, as if the very walls had been holding their breath for years and were finally beginning to exhale, allowing light to penetrate corners that had been shrouded in shadow and warmth to seep into rooms that had felt perpetually cold. Sunlight began to find its way through windows that had been kept shuttered, and flowers in the garden started blooming with colors that hadn't been seen on the estate for years, as if nature itself was responding to the gradual healing taking place within the mansion's ancient walls. The truth about Eleanor's past emerged in fragments, like pieces of a complex puzzle that had been scattered and forgotten, until someone cared enough to gather them together again and patiently work to understand the picture they revealed. She had been married to Theodore Blackwood, a man whose love for her had been as legendary as his business acumen, and together they had built not just a financial empire that spanned continents, but a life filled with joy and purpose that had been the envy of everyone who knew them. Their happiness had been complete when their daughter was born, a golden-haired child whose laughter had filled the mansion's corridors with a warmth that made even the most ornate rooms feel like home, transforming the grand estate from a showcase of wealth into a sanctuary of love. But tragedy had a way of finding even the most carefully guarded happiness, striking without warning like lightning splitting a clear sky, and a car accident on a rain-slicked road had taken both husband and daughter in a single, devastating moment that shattered Eleanor's world so completely that she had never fully recovered from the impact. The woman who emerged from that grief was harder, colder, and infinitely more alone than the one who had entered it, like metal that had been heated to the breaking point and then plunged into ice water, becoming stronger, but also more brittle in the process. She had spent the years since building walls that were designed to keep the world out, and her pain safely contained within, creating a fortress of the heart that no one had been able to breach until Maria's arrival. Maria listened to these revelations with the understanding of someone who had faced her own losses and understood that grief could either destroy a person or transform them, depending on the choices they made in their darkest hours. The other servants began to whisper about the miracle occurring within Blackwood Manor's ancient walls, speaking in hushed tones about changes they had never expected to witness in their lifetimes of service to the estate. Hartwell, who had served the family for over 30 years and had watched Eleanor's transformation from loving wife and mother to fearsome recluse, found himself smiling for the first time since the funeral, his gaunt features softening in ways that made him look years younger than his actual age. The cook began preparing meals with a joy she had almost forgotten existed, humming old songs as she worked and creating dishes that reflected not just technical skill, but genuine pleasure in the act of nourishing others. The mansion's oppressive atmosphere lifted like fog burning off in morning sunlight, replaced by something that wasn't quite happiness, but was certainly hope. A sense that the future might hold possibilities that had seemed impossible just weeks before. Eleanor started taking meals in the dining room again, instead of having trays sent to her private chambers, and occasionally Maria would catch her humming softly as she moved through the corridors, melodies from a time when music had been a source of comfort rather than painful memory, when songs had the power to heal rather than wound. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was more like watching a garden come back to life after a long, harsh winter, with small signs of growth appearing daily until one morning you realized that spring had arrived while you weren't paying attention. Maria's fearlessness in the face of Eleanor's legendary temper had somehow given the older woman permission to remember who she had been before grief had redefined her. And the result was a slow but steady return to something resembling life rather than mere existence. The first genuine smile Maria witnessed from Eleanor came on a Tuesday afternoon when they were working together in the mansion's conservatory, a glass-enclosed room that had been Theodore's gift to his wife and had stood empty since his death like a shrine to happier times. Sunlight streamed through the restored windows, casting rainbow patterns across the floor, while the two women carefully tended to plants that had somehow survived years of neglect through sheer determination and perhaps a touch of magic that lingered in places where love had once flourished. Eleanor's hands moved with surprising gentleness among the leaves and stems, her touch reverent as she coaxed life back into specimens that had been on the verge of giving up hope. And when a butterfly landed on her shoulder, the expression of wonder that crossed her face was like watching a statue come to life after centuries of stone sleep. "Theodore always said that butterflies were messages from heaven," she murmured, her voice carrying a warmth that Maria had never heard before, tinged with the kind of tenderness that came from memories too precious to be shared with just anyone. The moment stretched between them like a bridge connecting past and present, and Maria realized that she had succeeded in doing what a dozen other maids could not. She had helped Eleanor remember that feeling. Human didn't have to mean feeling pain, that opening one's heart to the possibility of joy didn't automatically invite destruction. The conservatory filled with the sound of their quiet laughter, a sound that seemed to echo through the entire mansion and announced that Blackwood Manor was finally, truly home to someone again, rather than simply a beautiful mausoleum where a broken woman waited for her own ending. Eleanor's reputation in the surrounding community began to shift as word spread that the fearsome widow of Blackwood Manor had somehow found her way back to humanity, transforming from local legend into something approaching a normal person with feelings and vulnerabilities like everyone else. Tradespeople who had once approached the estate with trepidation, crossing themselves and muttering prayers for protection, started arriving with genuine smiles and stories to share, no longer afraid that they might accidentally trigger the famous Blackwood temper that had become the stuff of local folklore. The local townspeople began to speak of Eleanor with something approaching fondness, rather than the mixture of fear and fascination that had defined their relationship with her for so many years. And invitations to social events that hadn't been extended in decades began appearing in the morning mail. Maria watched these changes with quiet satisfaction, understanding that her role in Eleanor's transformation had been less about changing who the woman was and more about helping her remember who she had always been, underneath the armor of grief and isolation that had protected her from further harm. The mansion itself seemed to reflect the change in its mistress. Rooms that had been shuttered were open to light and air. Gardens that had been allowed to grow wild were carefully restored to their former glory. And the oppressive silence that had characterized the estate for so long was replaced by the comfortable sounds of a house that was truly lived in, rather than merely inhabited by ghosts of happier times. Eleanor began receiving visitors again, hosting small dinner parties that brought laughter and conversation back to rooms that had echoed with nothing but footsteps for years, and the sound of human voices raised in joy rather than anger gradually filled spaces that had known only sorrow for far too long. The relationship between Maria and Eleanor evolved into something neither woman had expected when their unlikely partnership began, defying all conventional expectations about the boundaries that should exist between employer and employee. It wasn't friendship in any traditional sense. The barriers of class and circumstance were too firmly established for that kind of easy equality. But it was something deeper and more meaningful than a simple business arrangement, a bond forged in the crucible of shared understanding and mutual respect. They had become allies in the ongoing battle against the darkness that grief and isolation could bring, each woman drawing strength from the other's presence and finding in their daily interactions a reason to face whatever challenges the world might offer with courage rather than resignation. Eleanor began to share stories of her life before tragedy struck, painting pictures of happiness and love that helped both women remember that such things were possible, even in a world that could be cruel and unpredictable, her words weaving tapestries of memory that brought color back to rooms that had been draped in black for too long. Maria, in turn, shared her own dreams and aspirations, finding in Eleanor not just an employer, but a mentor who could offer guidance drawn from decades of experience with both triumph and defeat. Someone who understood that survival sometimes required making difficult choices, but that those choices didn't have to define the rest of one's life. The mansion's corridors, once filled with the echo of solitary footsteps that seemed to announce the loneliness of their owner, now rang with the sound of two women who had found in each other exactly what they needed to remember how to live, rather than simply endure the passage of time until death offered its own form of release. As seasons passed and the anniversary of Maria's arrival at Blackwood Manor approached, both women reflected on the journey that had brought them to this place of unexpected peace and mutual understanding, marveling at how much had changed in what felt like both a lifetime and a moment. The mansion that had once been a fortress of isolation had become a home again, filled with light and warmth, and the promise of tomorrow bringing new possibilities rather than simply another day to be survived. Eleanor had not forgotten her losses. Such things were too profound to simply disappear like morning mist touched by sunlight. But she had learned to carry them differently, as memories to be treasured rather than wounds to be protected, understanding that love didn't have to end with death if one had the courage to let it transform into something eternal. Maria had found in her position at the manor not just employment but purpose, understanding that her fearlessness in the face of Eleanor's legendary temper had been exactly what was needed to unlock the humanity that grief had hidden away, like treasure buried too deeply to be easily found. The other servants, who had once moved through the corridors like frightened ghosts, now worked with genuine contentment, their faces reflecting the peace that had settled over the entire estate, like a blessing long overdue. Visitors to Blackwood Manor often remarked on the remarkable transformation that had occurred within its ancient walls, sensing something indefinable but unmistakable in the atmosphere, a quality that spoke of healing and hope rather than loss and despair. The fearsome reputation that had once defined Eleanor Blackwood had been replaced by something far more valuable, the recognition that she was, once again, fully and completely alive, ready to face whatever the future might bring with the knowledge that she no longer had to face it alone. We hope you enjoyed this tale of courage, understanding, and the power of human connection to transform even the darkest of circumstances. Maria's fearlessness in the face of Eleanor's legendary temper shows us that sometimes what appears to be cruelty is actually pain in disguise, and that the right person arriving at the right moment can make all the difference in someone's life. Please let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love connecting with our audience from around the world and hearing how stories like this one resonate with people from different cultures and backgrounds. Your engagement and feedback mean everything to us as we continue to share these tales of hope, transformation, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit.